Welcome to the Deeper Thinking podcast. Power doesn't need a name. It doesn't need a uniform, a flag, or a throne. It works in silence, in the fine print, in the unseen architecture of decision-making. It is not declared, it is assumed. And perhaps the greatest trick of power is making us believe that justice stands outside of it. Today's episode takes us into one of the most electrifying philosophical battles of the 20th century. A clash that remains unresolved, question that grows more urgent with every passing year. In 1971, Noam Chomsky and Michel Foucault faced off in a debate that was never just about theory. It was about the fundamental nature of truth, justice, and whether resistance to power is even possible. Chomsky, the rationalist, believed that justice is real, that there are fundamental moral truths embedded in human nature, and that power, whether corporate, governmental, or ideological, must be fought when it seeks to suppress them. Foucault, the historian of power, challenged this optimism. What we call justice, he argued, is not something separate from power. It is one of its instruments. Their debate was not just an intellectual exercise. It foreshadowed the world we live in now. If justice is real, then why does history show so many failures to uphold it? If power is inescapable, then is resistance nothing more than another illusion? And in an era where AI, surveillance, and digital monopolies now dictate the limits of speech, thought, and access, have we already lost the battle Chomsky and Foucault were fighting? Today's episode takes you into this ideological battleground where we will challenge assumptions, rethink the structures that shape our lives, and ask the question, can we ever escape power? Or is justice just another word for control? To explore more about the concepts and thinkers discussed, including Noam Chomsky's theory of universal justice, Michel Foucault's ideas on power and knowledge, and contemporary debates on surveillance capitalism, check the episode description for links to additional reading, resources, and recommendations. Power is rarely declared, it is assumed. It operates not through grand decrees, but through the unnoticed shifting of systems, the quiet embedding of authority into the fabric of daily life. If there was ever a moment when the world was truly free, it has long since passed, not because of a coup or a revolution, but because power does not need such theatrics. It functions in silence, in bureaucracy, in the structuring of knowledge itself. This is the uncomfortable reality at the heart of one of the most profound intellectual battles of the 20th century, the televised debate between Noam Chomsky and Michel Foucault in 1971. Their discussion was more than an academic exchange. It was a collision of two worldviews, two fundamentally different ways of understanding truth, justice, and power itself. Chomsky, the rationalist, argued that justice is real, rooted in an innate human morality that exists beyond history. Foucault, the historian of ideas, countered that justice is nothing more than a construct shaped by the forces that define knowledge, law, and social order. A fundamental element of human nature is the need for creative work, for creative inquiry, for free creation without the arbitrary limiting effects of coercive institutions. Noam Chomsky. Chomsky's argument is deceptively simple. He believes that just as human beings are born with the capacity for language, they are also born with a moral instinct, a universal sense of justice that transcends culture and history. This belief is foundational to his political philosophy. Society should be structured to maximize human creativity, freedom, and dignity, rather than serve oppressive institutions. In Chomsky's view, true justice exists independently of power, and the task of a just society is to protect that justice from corruption. Foucault, however, saw things differently. What we call justice is a function of power. It is not an independent standard against which power is measured. Justice is not something waiting to be discovered. It is something that is produced by those who control knowledge and institutions. Laws are not neutral arbiters of fairness. They are reflections of power. Even our understanding of morality is shaped by the historical forces that determine what is acceptable, legal, and punishable. From ancient monarchies to modern democracies, justice has always been a tool wielded by those who seek to govern. Their debate was not just theoretical, it was a battle over the very nature of human existence. Is justice a fixed principle, or does it shift depending on who is in control? Can truth exist beyond power, or is power what defines truth? As we unravel their arguments, we are not just looking back at a historic debate. We are stepping into a conversation that is still unfolding today. In an age where algorithms shape public discourse, where corporations control the flow of information, and where democracy itself is mediated through digital systems, the Chomsky-Foucault debate is no longer confined to the past. It is the very framework through which we must understand the present. There are moments in history when people rise, convinced that injustice is not just a social failure, but a violation of something deeper, something fundamental to what it means to be human. The certainty that fairness exists beyond law, beyond power, beyond history itself, this is what fuels revolutions, resistance movements, and struggles for freedom. But is this certainty justified? Can justice exist beyond the structures that govern us, or is it merely a convenient fiction, a story we tell ourselves to make sense of power? Noam Chomsky refuses to accept the latter. For him, justice is not an invention of history. It is a real, universal principle, rooted in human nature itself. Just as language is an innate faculty, so too is morality, an internal compass that drives people toward fairness, dignity, and cooperation. To deny this, he argues, is to deny something essential about human beings. If a child does not need to be taught that suffering is wrong, if oppression sparks instinctive outrage, then morality must exist beyond the shifting sands of history. This belief forms the foundation of his activism, the conviction that oppression is not inevitable, it is a perversion of what should be. Chomsky's ideas align with thinkers like Martha Nussbaum, who argues that justice is inseparable from human flourishing. If people recoil at cruelty without needing instruction, if they recognize dignity before being told, then fairness must be more than just a social agreement. It must be something intrinsic. And if that is true, then societies must be structured to protect and expand this moral instinct, rather than suppress it. For Chomsky, the greatest threat to this instinct comes from systems of coercion that strip individuals of their freedom and creativity. He is particularly scathing in his critique of capitalism, not merely as an economic system, but as a mechanism of control that reduces human beings to tools of profit. He warns that multinational corporations, despite their claims of neutrality, are private tyrannies, making decisions that shape billions of lives without democratic accountability. These institutions dictate wages, suppress dissent, and limit human potential, all while maintaining the illusion of free choice. His critique is not abstract. Its consequences are everywhere. The rise of the gig economy, for example, perfectly illustrates Chomsky's fears. Companies like Uber and Amazon have redefined labor, not by empowering workers, but by turning them into disposable assets, denied stability, stripped of protections, and placed at the mercy of algorithms. This is not just an economic shift, it is a seizure of power, one that determines who gets to live with dignity and who remains trapped in precarity. For Chomsky, justice demands that these structures be dismantled, that power be returned to individuals, that society be built around freedom rather than exploitation. But here a deeper question emerges. If justice is so universal, why has it never been fully realized? Why do systems of oppression not just endure, but evolve? If morality is innate, why does history not reflect its triumph? These are the cracks in Chomsky's argument, the gaps where Michel Foucault steps forward, not to deny oppression, but to ask a more unsettling question. What if justice itself is just another tool of power? The tension in the room is palpable. The debate has moved beyond intellectual discussion. This is a fundamental collision of worldviews. Chomsky leans forward, his voice steady but urgent. There is a sort of an absolute basis, ultimately residing in fundamental human qualities, in terms of which a real notion of justice is grounded. He believes this with conviction. Without universal moral principles, the world descends into relativism, where no act can ever truly be called unjust, where oppression is indistinguishable from governance, where power dictates morality rather than morality limiting power. Foucault, unshaken, watches him for a moment before responding. What we call justice is a function of power. It is not an independent standard against which power is measured. There is no absolute basis for justice, no morality that exists beyond history. Every ethical system, every legal code, Every act of resistance is shaped by the very forces it claims to oppose. Justice is not a neutral principle, it is a language of control wielded by those who define its terms. Chomsky refuses to accept this. To him, Foucault's argument is not just wrong, it is dangerous. If justice is merely a construct, if it does not exist beyond power, then what justifies resistance against tyranny? If morality is always dictated by those in control, then does that mean the powerful are always justified? Slavery, genocide, dictatorship, were these merely different configurations of power rather than moral abominations? He cannot accept a world in which there is no higher ground to stand on, no truth that rises above power. Foucault does not argue that oppression is acceptable, only that its definition is never neutral. What Chomsky calls universal justice is, for Foucault, a historical artifact, shaped by the same forces it claims to resist. The laws that once upheld slavery were considered just in their time. The notion that war crimes exist is a modern construct. Even human rights, as sacred as they seem, are not eternal truths but products of Enlightenment thinking, forged in specific historical conditions. To fight for justice is not to escape power, it is merely to shift its balance. The implications are unsettling. Chomsky sees power as something that can and must be dismantled to reveal the truth beneath it. Foucault sees power as inescapable, as the very structure through which truth is produced. Chomsky believes in resistance as a moral duty. Foucault suggests that even resistance operates within the logic of power. And if Foucault is right, what does that mean for the world we live in? Are revolutions always doomed to recreate the very hierarchies they overthrow? When corporations adopt the language of just diversity, inclusion, empowerment, are they advancing fairness or simply absorbing dissent into the logic of profit? When governments claim to fight for human rights, are they upholding universal principles or merely redefining justice to suit their interests? If Chomsky is right, then there is something worth fighting for, something beyond power, something real. But if Foucault is right, then even that fight is simply another iteration of control. Which is it? And more importantly, who benefits from the answer? The world today is not one of open oppression, but of quiet influence, where power operates through algorithms, bureaucracies, and the unseen architecture of digital systems. Governments no longer need to silence dissent with brute force when they can simply make voices invisible. Corporations do not have to suppress political movements when they can turn activism into branding. In this landscape, the question that divided Noam Chomsky and Michel Foucault in 1971 remains unresolved. Is justice real, or is it simply another tool of power? Chomsky's belief is unwavering. A fundamental element of human nature is the need for creative work, for creative inquiry, for free creation, without the arbitrary limiting effects of coercive institutions. This is not just an abstract claim, it is a foundation for resistance. If justice exists beyond history, if morality is an intrinsic part of human nature, then systems of control must always be fought. Whether in the form of government repression, corporate monopolies, or ideological censorship, power is an obstacle to human flourishing, not an inevitable force to be accepted. This belief has shaped movements for free speech, labor rights, and democratic governance across the world. When journalists risk their lives to report on corruption, when whistleblowers expose mass surveillance, when workers organize against exploitation, these are not just acts of resistance but affirmations of an underlying moral truth. Without this truth, there is no reason to fight at all. The world would belong to those who wield power and nothing more, but Foucault would caution against such certainty. What we call justice is a function of power. It is not an independent standard against which power is measured. The systems that claim to uphold justice do not stand apart from power. They are embedded within it. Courts, governments, even human rights organizations all operate within structures that define what counts as justice, who is deserving of protection and who is excluded from its benefits. The very idea of freedom is shaped by the conditions of the time. This is not merely a theoretical argument. Around the world, platforms that once promised free speech now decide whose voices are amplified and whose are silenced. Not through law, but through invisible processes of moderation and algorithmic selection. Governments speak of democracy while deploying surveillance tools that track and predict dissent. Economic systems promise opportunity while ensuring that wealth remains in the hands of the few. Are these contradictions, or are they simply how power functions? Chomsky would argue that such distortions of justice must be corrected, that power can and should be confronted with truth. But Foucault would ask, whose truth? If knowledge itself is shaped by power, then no act of resistance is ever truly outside its reach. Even movements that seek to dismantle oppression may simply be reconfiguring the mechanics of control. And so the debate remains unresolved. If Chomsky is right, then justice is worth defending, even against overwhelming power. If Foucault is right, then justice itself may be nothing more than a shifting illusion. But in the world we live in now, where truth, freedom, and justice are contested in ways more complex than ever, the real question is no longer just who is right, but whether we can afford to be wrong. There are moments when history seems to demand a choice, to act or to remain silent, to resist or to conform, to believe in justice or to question whether justice has ever been anything more than a convenient fiction. Chomsky and Foucault did not just disagree on philosophy, they disagreed on what these choices mean. Chomsky believed that justice is real, that it exists beyond power, beyond history, beyond the institutions that seek to manipulate it. Foucault warned that even this belief is a function of power, that truth itself is always shaped by those who claim to define it. In a world shaped by surveillance, by algorithmic governance, by political narratives that shift faster than they can be fact-checked, the question is not whether their debate is still relevant, it is whether we can afford to ignore it. If Chomsky is right, then justice is something worth fighting for, something that must be protected from corruption, defended against those who would redefine it to serve their interests. But if Foucault is right, then power does not need to rewrite justice. It is already embedded in the structures that define it. The struggle for truth is playing out everywhere, in the fight over who controls social media platforms, in the question of whether AI can ever be neutral, in the battle over education, and whose history is taught. Is knowledge something we uncover, as Chomsky insists, or is it something that is always produced, as Foucault argues? Do the institutions that claim to serve justice truly stand outside power, or are they merely its latest expression? Power is everywhere, not because it embraces everything, but because it comes from everywhere. Foucault's words suggest that every attempt to resist power is already part of its logic. Chomsky, however, would refuse to surrender to such cynicism. There is a sort of an absolute basis, ultimately residing in fundamental human qualities, in terms of which a real notion of justice is grounded. If this is true, then we are not prisoners of history, we are agents within it, capable of building something better. Both possibilities are unsettling. If Chomsky is wrong, then every revolution is just another cycle of power reshaping itself. Every fight for justice, another illusion. But if Foucault is wrong, then power is not absolute and resistance is not futile. But that would mean accepting that history has been a long, terrible failure of justice to truly emerge. And so we are left with a choice, not just between Chomsky and Foucault, but between hope and skepticism, between resistance and inevitability. If justice is real, then it must be defended, no matter how often it is betrayed. But if justice is nothing more than a product of power, then we must ask, who benefits from the world we live in today? And do we have any say in what comes next? Thank you for listening to this episode of the Deeper Thinking podcast. I'm Holly, your digital narrator, and it's been a pleasure exploring these ideas with you. For further reading, resources, and recommendations, visit the episode webpage linked in the description. Until next time.